May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. What makes a place sacred? It's a rich word, isn't it? Sacred. It evokes something special, spiritual, beyond our usual experience, and yet it's a little hard to pin down. In that way, it's kind of like the positive version of the word obscene. We may not be able to exactly say what it is, but we know it when we feel it. Sacred is a bit subjective in the same way. Two people can walk into the same place, and one person can be overwhelmingly moved, feeling energy, transcendence, a connection to something deeper. And another person can just be chilling in the corner answering texts. When I was in Ireland, I spent a week in the Glendalough Valley, a jewel of a place nestled deep within the Wicklow Mountains southeast of Dublin. This valley has long been considered sacred in the traditions of Celtic spirituality. It began with the Druids, who felt this particular space to be a thin place, a realm where the veil between the material world and the spirit world was almost transparent. Walking the hills and refreshing myself in the rivers and the natural wells, I could feel what they meant. The divine energy was just so palpable. It takes very little effort to cross over in a thin space. You just know it when you feel it. In the 6th century, a rather eccentric monk named Kevin felt it and settled in that valley where he eventually established a monastery. Even before St. Francis, St. Kevin found God's presence in the wild country and the wild creatures who lived there. Not surprisingly, he was a bit of a spiritual extremist. One legend says that during the season of Lent, he was praying in his tiny, rustic hut, which was so small that when he stretched his arms out, they went out the windows. So as Kevin stood motionless praying with one hand out the window, a blackbird saw his hand and, thinking it was a good place to build a nest and lay an egg, did just that. And Kevin, feeling such deep compassion and kinship for the bird, just kept it there, perfectly still, for weeks until it hatched. Every image you see of St. Kevin in Ireland has a blackbird perched on his outstretched arm. There's even a brand of Irish whiskey distilled in the Glendalough Valley which bears that image of St. Kevin with the blackbird on the label. Thin places can do crazy things to people. Irish whiskey can too. But that's a sermon for another Sunday. Stay tuned. In our scripture story this morning, we hear about another thin place, the Temple of Solomon. Now, we don't hear too much about Solomon in our usual lectionary cycle, but most of us know him as the son of King David, who inherited the throne, and whose only request of God was that God grant him wisdom. And God did that. But as luck and politics and military plunder, no doubt, would have it, Solomon also became stinking rich. So rich, in fact, that he became known not only for his wisdom, but for his 900 wives, his extravagant clothing, his lavish palaces, and as we heard this morning, the construction of God's elaborate house, the temple in Jerusalem. This building of a temple represents a dramatic turning point in the story of the Hebrew people. You see, for centuries they'd been nomads, living in the wilderness, seeking the promised land, struggling at times, conquering at times, but always carrying their greatest treasure with them, the tablets containing the 10 Commandments, housed in the Ark of the Covenant. For generations, this ark was the only physical representation of the unknowable and uncontainable God, who also camped out with them. It was their reminder that no matter how vast God's presence, no matter how unimaginable God's power, God was also walking right alongside them. And now, after centuries of wandering, they were going to bring God home. And what a home. This was a building project like no other. The finest materials, the most awe-inspiring spaces, the most intricate details. But all that awesome stuff comes with baggage. They've traded the wonder and vulnerability of the wilderness for the certain walls of a building. They are settling down. And with that comes hierarchy and wealth and territory to protect, which means raising an army and drawing boundaries and generally behaving like every other kingdom. And in building a house for God, the Israelites are also now attempting to contain that once uncontainable God, placing their most sacred symbol, the ark, in the Holy of Holies, at the center of the temple, where access is restricted to a select few and ordinary people must keep their distance. It seems they've succumbed to the ultimate spiritual paradox. In trying to find a special place to worship God up close, they risk boxing him off and moving her farther away. I think we can still hold on to that paradox today with our sacred spaces. It seems we humans so often default to wanting to put walls around God. It's very interesting to travel around ancient lands like Ireland and Scotland and see how people have layered their sacred places across centuries, across millennia. It always begins with someone stumbling across a place, a hill or a well or a forest that seems to vibrate with connective energy between the spirit and the land. And soon a small shrine is built to mark the spot. And then the next generation adds a place for people to worship. And then the next builds walls that go up, and a roof is added, and symbols are carved into the doorways. In time, very often, new people move into the neighborhood, bringing new religions and often displacing the indigenous worshipers. And these new people build their sacred places over top the old ones, sensing the thin space that resonates there. Throughout Europe, hidden beneath many of the most imposing cathedrals, forgotten for centuries, lurk tiny wells or hidden caves that once upon a time signaled to their ancestors, God lives here. I believe there is something very organic about that kind of sacred space evolution. It honors the connection between the thin place and the people. But what happens when a sacred space is founded for more practical reasons? Now, I don't know enough about ancient Middle Eastern history to know if the site of Solomon's temple is atop a primitive shrine. It very well may be. But it certainly also could be that Solomon chose that site simply because it had the best view of the mountains, or was on an established trade route, or was an easy commute from his house. I think many of our current churches, including this one, were built for those kinds of logistical reasons. We don't hearken back to ancient thin spaces much here in this part of the world. We build where it's practical. Is it near the highway? Will the soil drain properly? Is there enough room for parking? Hardly the stuff of mystery and awe, and yet for many people, these ordinary buildings on ordinary plots of land have become sacred. How does this happen? Can a thick place become thin? I believe the answer is yes. For I am constantly moved by the number of people who walk into this space for the first time and feel an overwhelming spiritual presence, a palpable sense of peace. These are not often folks who are spiritual seekers either. They might be here for a concert or a lecture or a fair trade sale, and they wander into this sanctuary and they are overwhelmed. It happens a lot when the labyrinth is open. Someone walks in from the street on their way home from work or running an errand, and they're a little curious about what's going on in here on a Wednesday evening. And so they come on in and they walk into the sanctuary, and they may walk the labyrinth or they may just sit and meditate. But when they leave, sometimes they are in tears, feeling a spiritual energy they'd never felt before, remembering a moment of grace in their lives long forgotten. Folks who come to worship here for the first time will often say to me, I don't know what it is about this place, but I walked in and I knew I was home. One man said he could feel the prayers and hopes and intentions and sorrows that people have brought over the years just saturating the walls and the ceilings, and that he felt the Spirit just hovering there with all of that. And I believe that that really is true. I believe that the prayers and the rituals and the songs and the yearnings and the tears that we share here all contain spiritual energy. They are resonant with our longing for God, and they can fill a place. They can make it thin. Our text from Solomon is just such a prayer of yearning and hope, an enormous, passionate, heartfelt prayer to God that that temple be a place that is resonant with God's presence. Solomon prays that all who enter will know that they are in God's house, that God lives there, and will feel that sense of connection and peace that will make it sacred. And he invites everyone, friend and stranger alike, to add their prayers to his own. And yet Solomon recognizes the ultimate inadequacy of any place. He knows that God cannot and must not be contained in any one place for any one people. Even heaven and highest heaven cannot contain you, he says, much less a house I have built. In order for this temple to be truly a sacred place for God to call it home, it must also be a place where prayers and dreams and sorrows are shared by all who come. I believe that this place here, our very own sanctuary, is just such a thin place, made thinner with each prayer that we offer, each vow that we make, each ritual that we share within its walls. Each time a child is baptized or a couple is married, or a saint is buried, every time we give thanks for our blessings or cry out in sorrow, every time we feel God's presence in this place, it becomes so much more than stone and stained glass and worn out carpeting. It becomes sacred for all of us. I believe that what people feel when they walk into this place, they feel the generations upon generations of prayers that have saturated this sanctuary, including those of us gathered here today. Have you ever experienced God deeply in this place? Have you ever been met by a profound sense of peace or an unexpected moment of grace? Was it in a song, or a prayer, or a sermon, or the touch of someone's hand? Was it in a quiet corner by yourself, or in the middle of a noisy celebration? Did it come as a nudge, a whisper, or a raucous shout? Or maybe it was an unsuspected moment of ordinary grace, right where you are sitting now. All of these moments add to the layers that make this place sacred, and it can be so powerful for us to revisit them. And that's what we will do here this morning. As you are able and as you are comfortable, I'm going to invite you to take a symbol of a sacred encounter that you may have had in this place. So take a moment and reflect perhaps on an experience that you can locate within this place. And as you feel moved, please come forward and take a stone from the basket that I will be holding, and then go to that place in the sanctuary where you felt an encounter, a place that feels like a thin space for you, and leave your stone there. As you do, you may offer a prayer of thanksgiving or blessing or wonder or even yearning, whatever is on your heart, and then return to your seats. When you leave worship this morning, please, you may collect the stone and take it with you, knowing that you will carry that thin place with you wherever you go. May the blessings of this place follow you throughout your days. May the prayers of your heart be a threshold to the sacred, and may the ordinary moments of your life reveal an extraordinary grace. For every place is a thin place when we know that God lives there. Amen.